Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out today. Certainly appreciate your presence here. When we first started this event, we thought, well, we'll be lucky to get 75 people to show up. And so we've beat that number, but I think it speaks to the level of interest in this topic. And I think that Dallas is really at an inflection point as a city. So this is going to be a presentation where we talk about really this issue of economic mobility and prosperity. And as I said, we are at an inflection point. You can just feel it in the air, I think, in our city. And I think that one of the values that's important to me is that we be intellectually honest about where we're at as a city and really the condition of our city. And I think that this new organization that we're launching can really help lead the way in that space. So as Wendy mentioned, for the past 3 years, I was the Chief of Innovation at DISD, and in that capacity, we did a lot of the work that's kind of in this space, and you'll hear about some of that. And I recently left DISD in February and decided to stay in Dallas with my wife and 2 kids. We really like it here. And this city really supported me when I came here a couple years ago, welcomed me with open arms, and really supported me as we did some really tough work in DISD and talked about issues of segregation and concentrated poverty. And so I never forgot that and decided that after DISD I wanted to stay in Dallas, and I remain interested in making this a better city for my own kids and for everybody. And so this is Opportunity Dallas. We're a new organization that focuses on economic mobility and prosperity. And this concept of economic mobility, it's a very simple concept, right? It's about doing better than your parents did. It's about moving up the income ladder from generation to generation. It's a centerpiece of the American dream. The thing that binds us all together. You got all the partisan stuff going on right now, but the one thing that we can unify around is this idea of economic mobility, that you really should have a chance to do better than your parents did. But we need to take a hard look in the mirror because we are increasingly a city of haves and have-nots. Dallas does not do well in terms of economic mobility. Dallas is not a good place to grow up poor, and that affects all of us economically and particularly in the pocketbook. And so we need to come together, and I hope that this is a start. So right now we're operating Opportunity Dallas out of a donor-advised fund at the Dallas Foundation. It's me and 2 other staff members. We've been working on a plan, getting stakeholders together, which I'll talk about, and we're ready to rock and roll. Hopefully we can get some longer-term funding here so that we can build out our staff and really get going. So let's get started with the presentation, and I always think that it's a best practice. There we go. All right. So I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, the bottom line up front. This is the case I'm going to make to you today. So the biggest challenge to economic mobility is this issue of concentrated poverty and segregation. It's going to cripple the future of our city if we don't deal with it. Good thing is we know how to deal with it, but it's going to cripple us if we don't. And it's the thing that nobody wants to talk about. And this is not just a South Dallas problem, contrary to popular belief. We are all paying an enormous cost for this economically and morally. But we know through research that when poverty is dispersed, that opportunities widen for individuals and it improves the entire city as a whole. So to help tackle concentrated poverty, I think one of the key things that we're going to have to do is focus on housing. Why? Because housing really drives the distribution of poverty within a city. And housing patterns really determine whether poverty is concentrated or it's dispersed. And I think the latest research is showing that housing is really the linchpin for economic mobility. It's the linchpin for education. It's the linchpin for social cohesion. And we need to create a broad and diverse infrastructure to help deal with it. And so what I say is that Dallas, we have kind of a sense of urgency around this issue of housing, but we have a lack of infrastructure. And we need to create that infrastructure to help deal with it. And I hope Opportunity Dallas can help play that role. So here's the real bottom line. This is a quote from Matthew Desmond, who's an urban sociologist at Harvard. He was in Houston this past week, and he said, quote, "We can't fix poverty without fixing housing." And schools can't do it alone. Schools are a big piece of it, but they can't do it alone. And I say that as a strong education reformer. But schools are not going to be able to carry this load alone, and we need to be able to talk about that honestly. So we're going to start off with a quiz right off the bat. So hopefully you all logged into your phones. We'll see how this works. Always risky to do technology like this, but we'll see how it goes. So here's the first question. South Dallas, it's 45% of the county population. It's 60% of the city's land mass. What percent of the city's property tax base is it? Some of y'all might know this. Don't blurt it out. It's a smart crowd. It's a smart crowd. 15% is the answer. So South Dallas is 15% of the city's property tax base. Quite simply, a city cannot continue to concentrate poverty the way that we do and expect to thrive. And there's a difference between poverty and concentrated poverty. Concentrated poverty is where poverty is geospatially dense. It's places where more than 40% or more of households in a neighborhood are below the poverty line. So it's a neighborhood where you are poor, and most, if not all, of your neighbors are also poor. And there's mountains of research that show that concentrated poverty creates disaster. The best term, I think, for what it creates is compounded inequality, the sum of financial, psychological, structural disadvantages that make success statistically unlikely. And we remember what happened, remember the quiz, right? It weakens the city's property tax base. We know that that's one of the huge impacts here. What that quiz shows is that almost half of our city is contributing very little tax revenue. Why? Because we've concentrated the poorest families all in southern Dallas. And so we're expecting our city to provide full quality services to our people, right? When we call 911, we expect somebody to pick up the phone. We don't want tornado sirens going off on Friday night when our kids are trying to sleep. That was a long night for me and my wife. We don't want dogs attacking people in the front yard. But how realistic is it to expect that we're going to have high quality services across the full city when half of the city is providing very little tax revenue? And that doesn't mean that South Dallas is freeloading. It means we've structured a messed up system where it's become statistically next to impossible for people in concentrated poverty to climb out of it. And this lopsided tax base is driving up the tax rate for everyone. We know that concentrated poverty, it limits employment and earnings. There's few jobs in concentrated poverty. We know that it damages school quality and educational attainment. Any educator will tell you that a kid living in poverty brings challenges into the classroom. But when a school is concentrated in poverty, where nearly every kid is in poverty, the challenges compound. And the research is very clear that when you concentrate poverty in a school, the outcomes start to decline rather significantly. We know that it damages health. We know that it depresses home values. So think about this. If you can only afford to buy a home in a neighborhood like that, guess what? Those homes are not appreciating in value. Most people's wealth is wrapped up in their homes, right? So if your home doesn't appreciate in value, how do you gain wealth? How do you pass it along to your kids? We talk about the income gap in this country, but the wealth gap is even bigger, and it's largely due to segregated housing. We know that it increases crime. It's requiring costly city interventions that we're all paying for. All of us are paying for this. Back taxes, correctional costs, foreclosure costs, policing costs. It's destroying our social cohesion. Our local newspaper has an entire section called the North-South Trust Divide. We know that it reinforces racial prejudice. It's a pretty simple question, right? How are we going to understand each other if we don't live together? It deters lenders and developers. It drags our economic growth. And morally, it's just unacceptable. And it's irresponsible. And it's reached crisis levels in Dallas. So yes, every urban area has issues like this, but our numbers are not normal. And they certainly aren't the numbers of a thriving city. These are the numbers from the Mayor's Poverty Task Force. We have the highest neighborhood inequity of any city in the US. Our poverty rates increased 42% over the past 15 years. 1 in 3 people of color are below the poverty line. We got 50,000 kids living in extreme poverty. Our median income has been declining for 30 years, falling at a steeper rate than our peer cities and Texas as a whole. We got over 27,000 residents that are working full-time, and they are still living in poverty. And over half of our households are making less than $50,000 per year. For too long, I think that we've assumed that this is a southern Dallas problem. It's across the Trinity. It's below the Trinity. And if you're affluent and you don't live in a disadvantaged area, you might think, well, that's a shame, but it probably doesn't impact my pocketbook all that much. And quite frankly, I'm just going to say it like it is. I've been talking about this for a while in Dallas, and there are some folks that I talk to who think that there's a benefit for them in this arrangement, that there's a benefit of having all the really poor people in a certain part of town. But there's an earth-shattering report out of Chicago that changes that narrative, and it shows us that segregation, living apart from each other by race and income, hits all of us in the pocketbook big time. So even if the moral stuff doesn't get you worked up, the economic stuff should. And here's why that Chicago study is relevant to Dallas. So this chart on the right is a RISI score. It's Residential Income Segregation Index. It's essentially an index of how segregated our neighborhoods are. And you can see that, according to this, Dallas is even more segregated than Chicago. So the effects that I'm about to talk about would also be found in Dallas. And I'd love for this study to be conducted in Dallas. So here's what researchers recently looked at. They said, you know what? If Chicago could just reduce its segregation to the national median, not solve segregation, just bring it down to the national average, what would happen in Chicago? And they found that incomes for African Americans would rise an average of $3,000 per person, which would increase the earnings of the region by $4.4 billion. Their GDP would increase by about $8 billion. There'd be a 30% drop in the homicide rate. We see that all the time in Chicago right now. 30% drop in the homicide rate, which would save $65 million in policing and $218 million in corrections costs. Residential real estate values would increase by $6 billion, which means more revenue for local government. And 83,000 more adults would complete a bachelor's degree. So here's a short clip from a man who I think says it well. This is Antonio Riley from the U.S. Housing and Urban Development Department.
It's a sad and known fact that one of the key indicators of the outcome for a child, whether or not that child have a better quality of life than their parent, is not the color of their skin. It's if they were born into a low-income zip code. That is a horrible fact, and we have to change that.
It is indeed horrible. And the bar graph on the left, it shows you that over 1 in 3 kids in Dallas are living in concentrated poverty. Not poverty, concentrated poverty. That's double the state average, and it's triple the national average. In the map there in the middle, those are neighborhoods highlighted where more than 3 out of 10 households are living below the poverty line. And then in the map on the far right, those are areas where in some places, more than 7 out of 10 households are below the poverty line. And note that when you get into the really extreme concentrated poverty, they're very rare in North Dallas. It is almost an exclusively South Dallas problem when you get to those severe numbers. We neither live nor learn together. And these two graphics that you see right now, they show residential segregation. So this one shows the share of low-income households that reside in majority low-income census tracts. And then the other one shows the share of upper-income households that reside in majority upper-income census tracts. So basically what it's saying is that poor people are isolated and wealthy people are isolated. And Dallas is at abnormally high levels. And by the way, this didn't happen by accident. Government played a very heavy role in segregating housing. You can look at redlining, you can look at steering, but that's a topic for another day. But don't think for an instant that this happened by accident. We know that housing segregation then leads to school segregation, which hurts student outcomes. I want to talk about this chart, this map of DISD. So everywhere where you see a dot, that's a campus in DISD. So there's 225 some odd dots there. Everywhere where you see a red dot, that's a campus that's 80% low income or more. So we are a sea of red dots. Look for the blue dot. That's the one campus that's less than 20% poor. Anybody can find it? It's like, where's Waldo? It's Lakewood Elementary, okay? If you look for the yellow dots, those are campuses that are between 40 and 60% economically disadvantaged. Those are campuses that you could say are socioeconomically diverse. But one of the key things that you got to look at when you look at those yellow dots is, are the classrooms diverse? It doesn't always play out that way at the school level. Sometimes what you find happen is there's segregation through programs, where more affluent kids are in the advanced IB section, and the lower income kids are in this sort of general track. So you got to drill down and see whether the classrooms are diverse. The other interesting thing here is you'll see the gray shading in the background. That's a function of median income. So the darker the shade of gray, the higher the median income. And so what you find is that there are some high poverty schools in some really wealthy parts of town. Preston Hollow Elementary is 85% economically disadvantaged, which suggests that if you are in that particular attendance zone, you have opted out to private school almost entirely. And then of course, we have the donut there in the middle of Highland Park ISD, which is 0.0% economically disadvantaged. So this is all to say, if there was a picture in the dictionary of structural school segregation, this would be the picture of it. DISD is the most economically and racially segregated school system in the country by a couple different measures. And we often lament the huge size of the achievement gap. You all heard of the achievement gap, right? the difference in achievement between white students and students of color, the difference between affluent students and low-income students. Now, of course, our schools can be more effective. There's no doubt about that. Strong teachers, strong principals, strong instruction, high standards, of course, right? But we also can't ignore what we've done structurally, because that matters in terms of outcomes as well. And we've got to be able to have that conversation at the same time. That schools matter, but also the structure of poverty matters. You often see these charts. They're meant to surprise. They shouldn't surprise us one bit. The outcomes of concentrated poverty are very, very predictable. So whether you're looking, and these are, I know it's a little bit tough to see, but whether you're looking at blight or median income or educational attainment or properties that owe back taxes or even households with disabilities or even segregated by households with disabilities, the worst conditions you find are always in areas of concentrated poverty. You tell me which areas are in concentrated poverty and I'll tell you which ones have the worst educational outcomes. Let's do a second quiz. In Texas, 30% of Hispanic kids and 23% of black kids live in high poverty neighborhoods. What percent of white kids live in concentrated poverty? So you see the Hispanic numbers, you see the African American numbers. What percent of white kids live in concentrated poverty? As a statewide statistic, by the way, it's not a Dallas statistic, but very likely the case in Dallas. The answer is 4%. 4%. So, if you are poor and of color, you are much more likely to be in concentrated poverty where your neighbors are also poor, which often means you lack access to grocery stores, healthcare, walking, bike paths, high-performing schools. Michael Sorrell had a really good term for it. I think he called it access deserts. No banks, access deserts. I think that's an appropriate term. But if you're white and poor, you probably still have some affluent neighbors. There's amenities nearby. There's probably a DART station. There's a Walgreens to get your prescription. There's a bank for your deposits. And you're probably going to a school that's less concentrated in poverty. And that situational difference leads to dramatically different outcomes. So the reason I put this quiz up there is you cannot talk about this issue without talking about race. You just absolutely cannot do it. So the research is pretty clear that concentrated poverty doesn't work. What does work is residential diversity. I'm talking about mixed income communities where affluent, middle class, and low income people can live. Dispersing poverty is the key to better outcomes in education, individual income mobility, health, social cohesion. And there's two myths that I want to bust right now. So I say dispersing poverty, and some people say, well, what's the difference in just spreading it around? Isn't that just sort of playing musical chairs? The answer is no. Dispersing poverty doesn't just disperse poverty. Dispersing poverty reduces poverty over the long haul because it gives people a window to economic mobility that they otherwise wouldn't have had in concentrated poverty. And then other people say, you're just going to spread the problems around. If you have mixed income communities, poor folks, they're going to bring some of the problems with them. It's a total myth. Quite frankly, it has no basis in evidence. There's a lot of research that shows that mixed income communities and scattered poverty doesn't impact crime, doesn't decrease property values, and these are NIMBY arguments, right? Not in my backyard. Those are myths, and they're incredibly harmful myths that we're going to have to challenge as we proceed with this work. Look at places that have dispersed poverty at scale through housing policy. So I point to Montgomery County, Maryland, because there's some great research on them. Basically, in the 1970s, Montgomery County launched what is now the nation's oldest and largest mixed income housing program. And since then, they've produced about 13,000 affordable units scattered across the county instead of concentrating all the poor people in one part of town. And here's what's really interesting. Researchers have studied Montgomery County, and what they found is that poor children that were in mixed income housing did much better on tests than similar poor children that were in high poverty segregated schools. And they also found that mixed income housing was a more effective strategy to improve student achievement than investing more resources in high poverty schools. That's not to say that we shouldn't invest more resources in high poverty schools, but they did find that kids in mixed income housing did better, even though the high poverty schools were getting more pure pupil. And so if you look at the top chart there, it is not a surprise that Montgomery County does pretty well in terms of economic mobility for poor children, moving up the income ladder. Montgomery County does better than 4 out of 5 counties in the nation on that measure. Why? Because if you're poor in Montgomery County, you are much more likely to be in mixed income areas. You contrast that with Dallas County, which is right below it. We do better than only 1 out of 5 counties in the nation. We're pretty bad. The fundamental difference is that we've been pretty intentional about concentrating poverty. And if you're poor in Dallas County, you are much more likely to be clustered with other poor households. So overall, when you look nationally, there's a very clear trend that counties with strong income mobility tend to have more residential integration, and counties with weaker economic mobility tend to have more residential segregation. It's a very clear trend. And in case I haven't convinced you enough, I wanted to share with you the research of Raj Chetty. He's a renowned economist out of Harvard and Stanford, and in the past couple years, he has completely changed the narrative here. And he found that low-income children are most likely to succeed in counties that have less concentrated poverty. And he found that the poverty levels of your neighborhood have a huge impact on your life outcomes. So let's hear it from the man himself, Chetty.
Professor Chetty, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
You've written that where children grow up shapes their prospects as adults. Explain that.
So we find when looking at very large data sets covering the American population that where a child grows up in America, which county they happen to grow up in, has a profound effect on their chances of moving up in the income distribution.
Like what cities?
Atlanta is a good example of a city that's quite sprawling, where there's a sharp division between where blacks and whites live, between where low-income and high-income families live. And lots of cities in America look like that. Detroit is another example of a city that looks like that. And those cities, there are various reasons you might think, you'd get lower mobility in those areas, lower upward mobility. One of which is kids from disadvantaged backgrounds come into less contact with children from more affluent backgrounds. They have fewer role models, fewer people to kind of look up to and see the different career paths that you might pursue. They also have less resources in their public schools. So another strong correlated factor that we find is the quality of public schools in an area. Cities that tend to have better schools for middle-income families, they tend to have much better prospects for kids moving up in the income distribution.
You've looked at some 5 million children in the past few years. Tell me about the Dallas experiment and how it confirms what you've just been telling me.
Every extra year you spend in a better environment makes you more likely to go to college, less likely to have a teenage pregnancy, makes you earn more as an adult, makes you more likely to have a stable family situation, be married, for instance, when you're an adult. So in many dimensions, you see substantial improvements. Now, the Dallas study that you're referring to, or more generally, a set of work related to what's called the Moving to Opportunity experiment, which gave families housing vouchers to move to better areas, confirms what I just described to you.
You're talking about black families
Black
primarily?
families and white families. This experiment involved a very large number of black families who were
poor people.
Exactly. Families earning something like $10,000 a year. So really the low-income population. And what this experiment did is it gave these families vouchers to rent apartments in better areas and lower poverty areas. And you got these vouchers just through a lottery. So by chance you might have gotten a voucher, and I also applied for this program and I didn't get a voucher. And what that does is it sets up an experiment where we can compare the outcomes of your kids with the outcomes of my kids and test, exactly like in a science experiment, whether this policy really seems to matter. Does where you grow up matter? And what we find is that there are really substantial effects for kids who move at young ages to better environments. If you move to a lower poverty area when you were, say, like 5 or 8 years old, you're earning 30% more as an adult, you're 30% more likely to go to college. There are all these very big improvements for both blacks and whites in many cities around the US.
So Chetty talked about this generally, but I wanted to share the specific outcomes. He found that if you were a low-income kid and you moved to a mixed-income neighborhood before age 13, you're more likely to attend college, you're more likely to get married and have kids with a father present, 31% more in annual income over your lifetime, which increased your expected lifetime earnings by $302,000. You're more likely to live in better, lower poverty neighborhoods as an adult. You paid more to Uncle Sam in terms of federal income tax, and you were less likely to be on government welfare later on in life. And of course, the generational impact, that the grandkids were more likely to be raised in better neighborhoods by 2 parents that have higher incomes and more education. And that is what breaks the cycle of generational poverty. And so for me, the takeaway is that dispersing poverty, that's essentially what was happening in the Chetty study, dispersing poverty through housing policy reduces long-term poverty. And the younger you were when you moved, the better. So the poverty level of your neighborhood is pretty predictive of your life outcomes, financially, socially, educationally. And look, I study this stuff a lot. I don't know of any interventions that produce outcomes at this scale and scope. They are, in my mind, unrivaled. So on the next slide, I want to talk about our true north goal as an organization, and it's based a lot on the Chetty research. So we want to reduce the percentage of kids living in concentrated poverty from 37% right now to 25% by the year 2025. And of course, there are many levers you can pull to try to alleviate concentrated poverty. There's healthcare, there's transportation. And over time, I think as we grow as an organization, we'll look to those areas. But for an organization that's early, right, we have finite resources, we have finite staff, we want to pick the biggest lever and go deep. And for us, that's housing. Why? Again, because housing is the mechanism that drives the distribution of poverty, and it's the right time for us to deal with it in Dallas. So we got to get serious about mixed income housing. Why? Again, because housing patterns drive the distribution of poverty in a city. And when it comes to housing, where are we in Dallas? Where are we? Well, it's complicated. What I would say is that we have a sense of urgency, but we have a lack of infrastructure. And a couple years ago, you might remember that there was a HUD lawsuit. And HUD had some negative findings that Dallas was basically using federal dollars to segregate housing. And regardless of where you fall in that debate, there were city officials at the time who said, well, you know, this is at least an opportunity to carry out reforms that we otherwise wouldn't have done. And to me, that basically meant developing an actual housing policy. We don't even have a housing policy. And since then, we've had different organizations that have issued policy recommendations. The Dallas Morning News editorial board has come out and said, yes, we need the writing of the city's first ever housing policy. They said, quote, public policy must be written to scatter affordable housing into diverse areas of the city. We obviously have the West Dallas situation. Communities are mobilizing. They're afraid of gentrification. The school district is hemorrhaging enrollment. Why? Largely due to a lack of available housing in our city. And so you ask this, we have all these things going on. Why do we still not have a comprehensive housing policy yet? Well, I would argue that there are 4 necessary elements that have to be in place that haven't yet. The first one is something this big requires cross-sector co-development. Instead of separate sets of recommendations from separate groups, we need one set of recommendations co-developed by all of these groups. And that means bringing together city officials and real estate developers and fair housing advocates, university experts, neighborhood associations, and residents to jointly develop policy. That's the best way that we're going to garner broad-based political support. And by the way, when I say neighborhoods and residents should be helping to craft policies, I mean it. This can't just be the usual elite sitting around the table. That obviously hasn't worked. We need to engage people in the policy process who have actually lived the experience. I didn't grow up poor. So I listen to those who have, and they should be informing the policy process alongside those who have the formal authority. All right, so number 2, we can't just have another politically commissioned task force where we just get together and talk about it. We need to put a science behind the collaboration, and that's where research-based collective impact comes in. That there's 5 elements of collective impact. There's developing a common agenda, there's tracking measurements against, tracking progress against shared measurements. You look at what Commit has done in education, right? Applying collective impact to education, and there's been some really great things that have come out of it. We need to apply the science of collective impact to accelerate progress in other areas like housing. Third is we need a backbone organization to lead this work. A fair and honest broker who can come in fresh, bring these folks together, and that's the void we would try to fill at Opportunity Dallas. And we would manage the strategic coherence of the work, right? So we got to bring together the right folks, facilitate the working sessions, identifying common goals, monitoring progress, sharing best practices. But we also got to do the logistics, right? The stuff nobody wants to do. Organizing the meetings, the project management duties, identifying the co-chairs, managing the agendas. Somebody's got to do it. Holding folks accountable when they don't show up for the meetings. And I think we can fill that role. And then the fourth piece is that even if we had a comprehensive housing policy, we don't yet have the resources to underpin the policies. And so that's another big piece of this. So what I'm talking about is we're going to have 2 streams of work. There's going to be policy development and resource advocacy. And you got to do both. Policy without resources is just a sheet of paper. And resources without policy is an incoherent way to spend money. It's kind of what we've been doing. And so we're going to pursue both streams of work. So let's talk first about the policy development process. And this slide shows you our plan for policy development. You don't have to read it, I know. Basically, it would proceed in 3 phases. There'd be short, medium, and long term. We'd have goals and measurements. And you can see some of the possible key indicators that we would use to track progress along the way. That's a critical component of collective impact. We don't have time to go through all this, but I want you to know that it's there and know that we're constantly refining it. But here's the Cliff Notes version of it. We want to try to develop policy in 4 domains. The first domain is revitalizing lower opportunity areas. Create growth, create jobs, improve the quality of life without displacement. Transforming low opportunity areas into higher opportunity areas. That's key. 2, at the same time that we do that, we have to enhance housing mobility and reduce barriers so that low-income households can access higher opportunity areas if they so choose. Nobody should be forced to live anywhere. This is about choice. And that's really the Chetty research, right? So for example, today in Dallas, there are many low-income families who have received federal housing vouchers, many of them. And the federal housing voucher, it's supposed to be your golden ticket to opportunity. And a voucher essentially covers the difference between what you can afford and the rent that's being asked. And it's a stable, lawful source of income from Uncle Sam. It's supposed to enable you to move wherever you want. And so let's say today in Dallas, you go to a landlord in a high opportunity area, and you say, here's my voucher. It covers the asked rent. I pass my criminal background check. I meet all the other requirements of tenancy. I'd like to live here. It'd be a better life for me and my kids. Today in Dallas, it's perfectly legal for the landlord to say no, just because it's a voucher. It's called source of income discrimination. It's a statewide, it's a national issue, but municipalities can be proactive about it. And the bottom line is that it is extremely difficult to find landlords in high opportunity areas that will actually accept a voucher. By some estimates in Dallas, about 60% of vouchers are unusable because of this problem, which is worse than most cities. And so I want to share with you the story of 26-year-old Farron Giles. There was a documentary on PBS Frontline just 2 nights ago, and I just couldn't resist. I had to put it in the presentation. So Farron Giles, she has a 6-year-old son named Isaiah. And it took her 6 years to get a voucher. 6 years. These wait lists are years long. And when she got the voucher, she said, you best believe I'm going to utilize this. And so let's see what happens.
We returned to Dallas one last time.
Can you spend 5 minutes talking?
It had been 3 months since we had met the women who had just received Section 8 vouchers.
But they're talking about moving you up?
Farron Giles had started a new job in North Dallas.
I'm hearing talks about my 3rd promotion.
And had hoped to move to a neighborhood near work. But she wasn't having any luck using her voucher anywhere.
I've been to Oak Cliff, I've been to South Dallas, I've been to Pleasant Grove, I've been way down south. Nobody wants my voucher.
In January, Farron ran out of time to use the voucher and gave it up. But she did find a place in Dallas public housing. We've been following families down in Dallas who've really struggled to use these vouchers. Why are they having such a hard time?
Well, this is a good example of why the affordability challenges that we have are a crisis. There is some discrimination against families who want to use these vouchers. We need to figure out ways to make sure that those families, when they have a voucher, can be successful in using it.
So after this clip, Farron said, quote, they think we are lazy and worthless. Even though we're financially less capable, we still love our children just the same. And she's since left her job in the north. It's tough to live far away from, it's tough to work far away from where you live. And it amazes me how much research we know. And what's even more amazing is how little of it we put into practice. So that's that issue. The third big domain is how do we increase the availability and the supply of mixed income housing? Just the supply of it, right? We got to get going on that, particularly in high opportunity areas. And 4, introducing this concept of inclusive development or inclusive gentrification. I know it sounds like an oxymoron, but I'll talk a little bit about it in a minute. So what I'm saying is that a comprehensive housing policy is going to require us to walk and chew gum at the same time. We need to enable low-income people to access high-opportunity areas if they so choose, while we also work to transform and revitalize disadvantaged areas. And people try to force you into one camp or the other, right? They say, well, either you support revitalizing poor areas or you support mobility for poor people out of those areas. It's not an either-or proposition. It's a yes and proposition, and so don't let people tell you that you have to pick one camp or the other. The most common misperception, I think, of my presentation is going to be that, well, when he says disperse poverty, he just wants to move all the poor people out of their neighborhoods. That's not what I'm saying at all. Dispersing poverty means way more than that. And what I really want is for people to have good choices of where to live. If you want to stay in your historical neighborhood, there ought to be opportunities there. And that means revitalizing disadvantaged areas. But if you're a voucher holder and you want to move into another area of the city, you ought to be able to do that too. And so this is about empowering people with choice. And a little kind of personal confession here. When I first, when I left the ISD and I sort of had this idea, I was kind of worried that people wouldn't see the need for a comprehensive housing policy. That maybe folks were happy with the whole let's make a deal, project by project at the council table, which is kind of how it's going now, right? We just sort of negotiate at the council table. And what I found was quite the opposite, that nobody's happy with not having a housing policy. Fair housing advocates want a policy. Residents want a policy. You go and talk to folks in West Dallas, where are you, Raul? They want a policy. And developers, real estate developers want a policy too. And their interest in it is predictability, having rules, having formulas, having a predictable point system so that you can get the economics to make sense to include affordable units. And currently nobody knows what to expect at the council table. You just kind of negotiate with the city. So I'm not saying that there's not going to be disagreements when we get into the actual policies. But what I am saying is at least we're off to a good start in the sense that everybody sort of agrees that we should embark upon this policy process. And you know what? That's a start. And people often ask, what do you mean when you say mixed income housing? What are you talking about? Well, I think that we need a very broad, inclusive definition of mixed income housing. It should include the full spectrum of folks, from folks that can pay market rate, to middle income, to moderate, to low, to extremely low income. We need to ensure that there's a fair distribution across the spectrum and not define the income bands too narrowly. So here's kind of the situation as I see it in Dallas. And this chart shows the levels of area median income. And it goes from middle income all the way to extremely low income. And so the lower income folks are in the blue shade. And some people argue, well, there's already a significant supply of available affordable housing for lower income folks. You have LIHTC, right, low income housing tax credits. You have Section 8, you have public housing. And that's true. There's a stronger supply of lower income housing than there is middle income housing. But if we just leave it at that, we are forgetting the lessons of Chetty. That life outcomes are about location, location, location. And the reality is that most of our supply of low-income housing is in areas of concentrated poverty and segregated in low-opportunity areas, and that's not good enough. Something like 95% of LIHTC projects that have been approved have been in majority non-white neighborhoods that are heavily poor. So if we really want to reduce poverty, we need more opportunities for low-income families to access higher opportunity areas. But we can't forget about the folks in the pink either. These are folks that are at 80 to 140% of AMI, the proverbial teacher and firefighter. And there's just not a supply for that. There's almost a total shortage, and we need way more. So that's why I define mixed income broadly, is that we have to look at how we can create mixed income communities where people at all levels can live, right? There's a percentage for market rate. There's a percentage for the teacher and the firefighter. There's a percentage for the bank tellers and the wait staff. And there's a guiding belief in what I'm saying, that we're all good enough as human beings to live next to each other, right? That's sort of embedded in what I'm saying. And so, after that last slide, you might be thinking, come on. This isn't how Dallas operates, man, come on. But let me tell you a story about Solar Prep. And Solar Prep, you might be familiar with it. It was a new choice school that we launched when I was at DISD. We launched it in the Knox-Henderson area in a vacant school building. And it's a new open enrollment choice school. It doesn't have attendance boundaries. It's open to kids from north, south, east, and west. And I decided that we were going to do something unprecedented in Texas. That for Solar Prep, we were going to reserve 50% of the seats for kids on free and reduced lunch, and the other 50% of the seats for kids not on free and reduced lunch. Kids from different income backgrounds ought to learn together. Not because it's a kumbaya thing, but because there's 60 years of research that shows that it works academically. And you know what people said to me when I first pitched this? Are you serious? This is Dallas. There's too many pains and scars here. There's no way that wealthy families are going to send their kid to a school that's half poor. The low-income kids aren't going to be able to keep up. They're going to drag the higher-performing kids down. And we did it anyway, and let me tell you what happened. Solar Prep is a great success. Wealthy families applied in greater numbers than low-income families. More than enough applications on both sides of the 50-50. And the elementary school from which we had the most applications to solar, anybody want to guess? Lakewood. Lakewood. Kristen was one of those parents. Parents were willing to seek out diversity. And Solar Prep is one of the most racially diverse schools in DISD, and that's a rare thing. The other thing is that low-income kids are doing great at solar. The mid-year data is very compelling that all kids are doing well, and that shows what those of us in education have known for a long time, that kids rise to expectations. And that's, of course, what the national research shows, too. And solar is now one of the most coveted schools in DISD. So the point is this. In mixed income situations, all boats rise. The mixed income didn't scare people away from Solar Prep. It attracted them to Solar Prep. And those girls are going to be a hell of a lot more prepared than we were at that age. You're going to hear the same arguments against mixed income housing that I heard against Solar Prep. No way. This is Dallas. Wealthy people aren't going to do it. Low-income people aren't going to be able to assimilate, or whatever word they want to use. But I know it can be done. I've seen it done. And we're better than that. We're better than false fears about each other. But what we need is a very intentional approach, a massive public-private commitment to create mixed-income communities at scale and to educate the public about why it's important. So today in Dallas, you can basically count on one hand the number of mixed-income communities that we have. Generally, if you're looking to buy a house, you're going to find something that's about $500,000 or more in a high opportunity area, or you're going to find something that's about $150,000 or less in a low opportunity area. Neither of those two options work for the teacher and the firefighter. That's why they go to the burbs. This is really a public safety issue, right? Our teachers, our firefighters, our police, they can't afford to live where they work. And so businesses also go to the burbs. Businesses can more easily attract employees if employees can actually live next to where they work. This is also not acceptable for low-income families, that the only affordable options they have are in areas of concentrated poverty and segregation. And so when you consider this problem, it's not surprising that half of Dallas renters and a third of homeowners are cost-burdened, which means that they're paying more than 30% of their family income to housing costs. And when you're cost-burdened, that means you have less leftover income to spend on other necessities like nutritious food or transportation. And so, yeah, that's the situation. It's what? How is this possible? How did this happen? So this gets wonky. Hang on. I'm going to move through it fast, but here's where it gets a little wonky. So to get us started down the policy track, we've compiled a policy matrix. By my count, we've had 6 different organizations that have issued recommendations. And so we've tried to compile them all into a matrix. And what you see is that really creative work has been done. And what these organizations are doing is they're talking past each other more than they're disagreeing on some stuff. And so in the yellow, you see the domains that I talked about on the earlier slides. Remember the 4 domains that I talked about? Well, this is the first one, revitalizing disadvantaged communities, right? The scale of the problem is so big, you have to transform high poverty areas into mixed income areas. And in here, you'll see a lot of recommendations, stuff like how do we attract mixed income home builders to vacant infill areas? By providing incentives such as discounted permitting or zoning or tree mitigation. There's also in here the example of purpose-built communities. If anybody's heard of the example out of Eastlake, Atlanta, the purpose-built community, a place that was disastrously poor, that is now mixed income 50-50. We ought to look to replicate that particular model. Everywhere where you see an X, that represents what that organization explicitly said in their report. Just because there's not an X doesn't mean that that organization is against the recommendation. It just means they didn't mention it in their report. I have a feeling that if we got all these organizations together and said, hey, I know you didn't mention it in your report, but would you support X, Y, or Z? I think the X's would start to proliferate. The other caveat here is that these are general recommendations. There's nuances not captured, right? So organizations might agree on general ideas, but they might disagree on the specifics. And so this is just a guiding document. The organizations haven't cross-checked this yet, so please don't treat this as an authoritative document. It's just kind of to show our approach to policy development. The second domain is that issue of how do you enhance housing mobility? How do you reduce barriers so that low-income households can access high-opportunity areas to help people like Farron Giles? And here you'll see recommendations like a regional voucher mobility program, sublease grantor programs, source of income ordinances, ramping up counseling services to low-income people so that they can navigate the very complex landlord marketplace. And then the third one, this is a big one, how do you increase the supply of mixed income housing? And this is where developers get really interested. And a common recommendation was, how do we have a package of incentives to get developers who are in higher opportunity areas to set aside a certain percentage to be sold at below market rate? And you can density bonuses, subsidies, ease parking regulations, and of course the incentives have to fluctuate depending on what level of AMI you're talking about, but we have never laid out a package of incentives. And we've certainly never aligned those incentives with the goals of inclusivity. There's also stuff in here around how do we rethink land bank programs, all that stuff. There's also a recommendation around creating a housing fund, which I'm going to get to in a short minute. And then the last one is inclusive gentrification, the oxymoron. The better term is probably inclusive development. But gentrification is already happening all over Dallas, right? Look at West Dallas, right? It's going on. And it can bring a positive influx of jobs, resources, and services to disadvantaged areas, but cities have to ensure that existing residents are not displaced or priced out so that they can experience the fruits of the progress. And there's national best practices for how you do this. It often starts with developing an early warning indicator system so that you know ahead of time which neighborhoods are getting close to gentrifying. As a city, we don't even have a common definition of what gentrification is. We just know it when it happens. When people are starting to get pushed out and the news starts writing about it, oh, gentrification. We should have been dealing with the West Dallas thing about 5 years ago. And what an early warning indicator system does is there's metrics that you can look at. So if the percent of white residents starts to tick up in a disadvantaged area of color, you know something's going on. If the rents start to tick up, you know something's going on. And then if the early warning indicator starts to go ding, 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 policy has to trigger certain responses, whether that be home improvement rebate programs, homestead preservation districts, extending tax credits to existing residents. This isn't just a West Dallas problem. Failure to plan here is going to cause this over and over and over again. So you look at the deck park, right? There's a pretty strong chance that that will lead to some gentrification. And if we don't proactively plan, in 5 or 10 years we'll be in the same situation that we are right now in West Dallas. A lack of planning will lead to displacement. But it's not just about preventing displacement. It's about enabling the existing residents to benefit from the progress. So when the jobs are coming in, when the restaurants are coming in, when the new construction is coming in, are existing residents being hired? Are they participating in the fruits of the progress? Are they being engaged as leaders in the effort, or is it just happening to them? Is it happening with them, or is it happening to them? That's an essential part of what policy should be around this issue. And then the last piece is just the miscellaneous piece, stuff that was either really broad or didn't fit neatly into a category. But basically, what we found when we were developing the policy matrix are 3 things. One is, look at how many policies that we could potentially have in our toolkit that we just don't. 2, there's more win-wins than you'd think. Not all of this is win-wins. There's going to be some serious disagreements. But there's more win-wins than you'd think. And then 3 is, we need a backbone organization to manage the complexity of this work. We got to get folks together. Separate issuances of policy reports aren't going to cut it. Imagine one set of recommendations from all of the groups. So we got to bring folks together and say, hey, in your report, when you said incentives, did that mean 50% AMI? Did it mean 80% AMI? When you said home improvement rebate programs, what exactly were you talking about there? We got to get to that level of detail, and I think we're going to need a backbone to do it. So that's kind of the approach to policy. Now let's transition to the resource piece. You got to have the resources to underpin the policies. And I think that we can play a role in advocating for greater resources. So a couple slides left, but I want to hit this one. A common recommendation that we saw was creating a housing fund to basically build and rehabilitate mixed income housing, a permanent dedicated revenue stream. And you can capitalize these revenue streams through city general funds, through general obligation bonds, through TIFs, fees, taxes. You look at what Charlotte has done with their housing fund. Since 2001, they have provided $93 million in gap financing to developers, and they've produced 5,500 affordable units. And they capitalize it through their bond campaigns. The Charlotte Chamber actually goes out to the voters and says, we need housing bonds, and they make the case for it, and the voters have consistently approved it. There are 470 cities in the country that have housing funds. Research shows that every dollar in housing funds can leverage about $6.50 in private sector investment. You can administer it with a city entity, a non-city entity, or even a newly created entity. And the timing is right as we embark upon a bond in November 2017. So the last quiz, pull out your phones. Here's the last quiz. So the last bond that we went out for as a city was in 2012. So in the 2012 City of Dallas bond issue, what percent was deployed to affordable and mixed income housing? And this was from the Urban Land Institute set of recommendations. What percent was actually deployed to affordable and mixed income housing? All right, so the answer is 3%. 3%. So we're about to see a bond issue in November 2017. And look, a lot of competing priorities. There's streets, there's parks, there's flood control. A lot of it's important, a lot of it needs to be balanced. But we need to invest in things that have the biggest generational ROIs. And few things match housing. And so I think that what we can do is be a champion and a voice on this issue and make the case to voters about the need for larger mixed income housing investments in the next bond package. 3% might be enough to sort of check the box and say that we care about housing, but it's really not enough to move the needle, particularly when you think about the scale of the problem. And I worry that we're going to make the same mistake in this upcoming bond package. So this is a picture of a recent set of recommendations that they're considering for the 2017 bond, and you can see that economic development and housing is just 7.5% of the bond package. But I was encouraged by a recent meeting that I had. I presented to the Bond Citizens Task Force, the housing subcommittee, and I presented to them some of the ROIs, and so I hope that there's some movement to try to treat housing as a co-equal to streets and parks and drainage. I'm not saying it should replace all the others, but it should be thought of as a co-equal investment to some of those other areas. I think we can make the case. We can rally the coalition, partner with organizations, share all the ROIs that I talked about. We need a massive commitment to mixed income housing, because also federal and state dollars probably aren't coming on this issue. Local dollars are going to have to be on the table. The ROIs are a no-brainer. In case all the previous research wasn't enough, I want to hammer home the economic case for housing investments. So housing investments can spark economic stimulus, can increase employment, right? There's direct jobs that are created, such as construction. There's indirect jobs, such as suppliers and materials. We know that it increases revenue for local government. It increases consumer spending in the area once the homes are occupied, retail, grocery. According to the National Association of Home Builders, building 100 affordable rental homes produces $11.7 million in local income generation, $2.2 million in revenue for local government, and 161 local jobs in the first year alone. So there's a multiplier effect. There's a ripple effect here. And other research shows that LIHTC housing, right, low-income housing tax credit, it has the same stimulus numbers. It has the same job creation numbers at comparable market rate units, and that's a really important point. You also take a look at Austin's 2006 affordable housing bonds. They go out for affordable housing bonds from time to time. They ask their voters for it. And you look at there was an analysis of the 2006 investments by Civic Economics and Housing Works Austin. And they estimated that the initial investment of $55 million in bonds brought $865 million in economic activity to the local government, which meant that for every $1 of initial investment, it yielded nearly 16 in economic activity, and that meant about 3,000 jobs. Also, if you don't have available housing in your city, you can't attract and retain businesses. Businesses know how important it is to have available housing, and they're not going to locate in areas that don't have it. There's also the ROIs. Remember back to the Chicago numbers? What happens when you reduce segregation? Mixed income housing can do that. Remember, property values, all those sorts of things from Chicago, real estate values, more people getting diplomas. There's the individual case. Think about Chetty, right? What happens to individuals that get exposure to mixed income housing? There's also a very strong health and wellness case here. That stable housing leads to better health outcomes, particularly for kids. If you can actually afford your rent, that means you got more leftover income for nutrition, for transportation to your job. There's less mental health problems. This is all research. I'm not making this up. Less eviction, less foreclosure, reduces stress. reduces your risk of asthma, lead exposure, injury, mold exposure. And there's also the case for greater social cohesion. And again, this is not kumbaya stuff. There is research that finds that folks that grow up in more diverse neighborhoods, it increases their exposure with people from different backgrounds, makes them more tolerant, it improves our cohesion, less racial prejudice, more culturally sensitive, more expansive and diverse social networks. There is a huge social benefit to this. All right, last two slides. So we put together an interim steering committee. Some of the folks are here today. I want to thank them for participating. So you can see some of the folks that have invested their time and energy into this effort. Diverse range of folks with from different organizations. They're currently helping us to refine and build this plan. You can go to our website, opportunitydallas.org, to kind of see who's on it. But I wanted to just thank them. We're about to go into our third meeting, and they've been incredibly, incredibly helpful. So that's it. Before we open it up for Q&A, I just want to end with a story here. And it means a lot to me that you would take the time and listen to me talk for 50 minutes. But I want to leave you with a story that at least inspires me to do this work. And so it's July 2016, so it's about a year ago. I had one of the great honors of my life. I was able to have dinner with Carlotta Walls Lanier in Little Rock at the Clinton Library. And she's the youngest of the Little Rock Nine. And for those that aren't familiar with the story of the Little Rock Nine, it's 1957, and there's 9 African-American kids who were the first to integrate Little Rock Central High School. And they were initially prevented from entering the school, as you can see in the picture, by Governor Orville Faubus. And President Eisenhower ultimately had to federalize the Arkansas National Guard, and he had to send in the 101st Airborne Division to literally escort the kids into the building. And so I'm sitting at this table. Carlotta's now 74 years old. I'm literally sitting in the presence of one of the great American heroes. I'm awestruck. And somebody at my table asks her, what was it like day to day at Little Rock Central High School? Once the cameras went away, what was it like on a day-to-day basis? And her answer completely floored me, changed the way that I look at my own life. She said there were 3 groups of kids at Little Rock. It was a small group of haters. They'd kick, they'd spit, push you into lockers, try to make your life miserable. And there was another really small group of sympathizers, kids that would come up to you and maybe whisper in your ear things like, I'm sorry this is happening to you. But then the vast majority of the student body were silent. They stayed neutral. They chose not to see it. And later that night on a panel discussion, Minnie Jean Brown-Trickey, who's one of the other members of the Little Rock Nine, she said, we estimated that there were probably 100 bad kids, 20 nice kids, and 1,900 silent witnesses. And I remember Carlotta wondering at our table, if the silent witnesses had just spoken up, maybe things would have changed for us. And that sent a shock down my spine. God, I hope I'm never a silent witness. And don't get me wrong, we've certainly come a long way since these pictures, but we can't be silent about the way that we've structured our city. We can't be silent about the outcomes that it's producing. So I'm going to keep talking about it. I hope you'll keep talking about it too. I hope that even though we might not agree on everything, that we'll join in this effort. And this is decades in the making. I talked with somebody yesterday who 30 years ago sat on a task force in Dallas to develop a housing policy, right? So obviously this is a hard issue. There's a reason why people don't take it up. It's going to be tough slugging on a tough issue that has been long overlooked, and it's going to require some really tough conversations. And also let me say, I'm the new kid on the block here. There are people that have been fighting this battle a lot longer than I have, and some of them are in this room, and I admire them for doing it. And I hope to learn from them. And I'm under no illusions that this is going to be a piece of cake. I'm not offering a magic bullet. I don't have a magic formula here. I just hope that we can be one more voice in the fight, because this is, the American dream lives or dies on this issue. I really believe that, and I think that that's something the research suggests. So my ask at the end is that we need an army of people talking about this stuff. So as you leave here today, at your cocktail parties, in your neighborhood association meetings, and at the water cooler, just talk about it. Talk about this issue. We have to talk about it. And if you need materials or information from us, just email us, go to our website, you can send us an email, we'll respond. We want to try to start something here. We want to get this issue on the table because we've overlooked it for too long, and I'm not okay with that, and I hope you're not either. So That's all I got to say. Let's open it up for questions. Oh my goodness. All right. Let's see. Does Opportunity Dallas provide direct services to people? That's a really good question. No. We're not talking about providing direct services to people. We're not helping voucher holders find landlords. We're not doing things like that. Our theory of action really exists at the strategy and the policymaking level. And so we'll be bringing direct service providers around the table, but we won't be providing the services ourselves. I think our theory of action is, for whoever asked it, is that we can no longer treat the symptoms of poverty alone. Treating the symptoms are important, right? But we have to tackle the structures and the systems that cause it in the first place. And so I guess an example that I would share with you is the case study of the migrant workers out of California. So decade, 15 years ago, this kind of came to the national consciousness that there was these terrible conditions of migrant workers in California. And organizations swarmed in and they started to treat the symptoms of the problem. Food banks, immunizations, clothes, kind of self-help programs, and all of that was needed, no doubt. But what was interesting is that the organizations that went in there, they didn't challenge the systems and the structures that were causing the conditions in the first place. Large-scale farming that relied on, labor-heavy field work with low wages, unregulated working environments, common pesticide use, which was causing all the health problems in the first place. We got to tackle those issues too. We can't just treat the symptoms, we've got to tackle the causes. And so that's kind of our theory of action, and it's also part of the reason why we're not thinking about providing direct services at this point. How will you combat NIMBYism to get poor families from low income to high opportunity areas? I think we have to talk about our proof points, solar prep. We finally have a proof point where we can talk about what happens in schools when high income and low income kids work together, because a lot of what's wrapped up in the NIMBY stuff is concerned about what's going to happen educationally. And I think we have proof points for what's possible when you have mixed income schools. So one is talk about the proof points, and the other one is talk about the research. Share the research and make the economic case. I think one of the things that we've done in Dallas for a long time is this has kind of been a social justice issue. And so the social justice warriors, go in and they talk about this issue. We got to make the economic case against this situation. We got to make the business case against it. We got to make the ROI case against it. It can't just be a social justice issue only. So I think we got to make the economic case as well. Obviously, it's a complicated question, but those are kind of my initial thoughts. It seems that every few years we meet and have hopes that this time we will unite agencies, funds, and ideas. What makes today more hopeful? Well, so I think that one is the sense of urgency that has been around this issue. The HUD lawsuit, for one, that created a sense of urgency, I think. So there was that we might not have had in the past. There are communities mobilizing, finally, in West Dallas around gentrification. I think the school district, the fact that the school district is losing enrollment is an existential problem for the school district. It is largely due to a lack of available housing. So there's a sense of urgency from folks that care about the situation of the school district. The DMN. The DMN is talking about this more than they ever have in the past, that we need a housing policy. We need to consider these issues. So I think that there are more folks, and we've had 6 sets of policy recommendations from really reputable groups, and there's been good policy recommendations issued. So it does feel like, at least to me, I haven't been around that long, but it feels to me that there's kind of a moment of opportunity here that might not have always been there in the past, and the research is there that hasn't been there in the past. The Chetty research is fairly recent stuff. It's 2014, 2015, 2016, and the Chetty research has really changed the narrative. So I think that as a community there's more urgency, but also from a research base there's more than there's ever been in the past, and we got to somehow wrap that all together and mobilize folks around it. So I think that that's what is different this time around, and we need a backbone organization to kind of lead the work and bring folks together, and that's kind of the void that we would hope to fill. Okay. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope it was interesting. Again, talk about this stuff. Go to our website, opportunitydallas.org. Send us questions. Let us know if you want to get involved. And we will. This is just the start. So we got a long, long way to go. But I hope you'll join us. Thanks.